an NIMH grant application to further his research on PTSD at a primary care level. He serves on the membership committee of the International Society for Trauma Stress Studies, and today he'll be presenting to us the feasibility and dissemination, the feasibility of disseminating and implementing prolonged exposure therapy for survivors of trauma in South Africa, and it's a mixed method studies. So Dr. Booysen will first do his presentation, and then we can have a chat afterwards, and he can answer any questions that you may have. So Dr. Booysen, please go ahead with your presentation.
Thank you so much, Rizwan. I just want to double check if you can still see my slides.
No, I can't see your slides. They've disappeared again. Oh, there we go.
Okay. Yeah, I think my laptop and Microsoft Teams is testing me today. Okay. So I'll just, hopefully they won't disappear again. So yeah, without wasting any more time, good afternoon, everyone, colleagues and friends. It's an absolute pleasure to be presenting here today. And essentially, the presentation will be a snapshot of my PhD project that I recently completed with under the supervision of Professor Ashraf Kaji, who's also in the psychology department at Stellenbosch University. So just a brief background to when and how this project came to life. I started working on the proposal around about 2016, but if I'm honest, I started chatting to Ashraf about different topics and methodologies and projects around about 2014, 2015 already. But it officially started in 2017 with our proposal being accepted and obtaining ethical clearance. And then data collection commenced in 2017. And the entire project was completed around about 2020. Yeah, and it would not have happened without the financial support of the NIHSS, SAHUDA, and the NRF, and intermittent financial support from the Rhodes University Research Council grants as well. Throughout this project, I had various conversations with my supervisor and also friends and colleagues of mine. And what really stood out, or questions that started to bother me, if I can put it like that, was, is this going to be just another mainstream trauma therapy intervention type of style study that's going to be conducted? Is it also going to be another mainstream type of therapy that was developed in the global north, and for it, it being imported into a South African context or imported into the global south? And how is this research relevant and responsive to the broader context of South Africa? And I think those questions helped me think about this particular line of work beyond the realm or the perimeters of another implementation study or intervention study. And I think that really gave birth to it being a mixed method type of project, to essentially start to think about, to think more than about effectiveness, even though the effectiveness of this particular treatment is the bedrock of it, but to also consider its feasibility within this context and its acceptability within this particular context. That for me became equally important aims and questions that I had to keep in mind as I worked on this project, and obviously now moving beyond this particular project in a post PhD phase. So the context of this research really stems from thinking about and obviously knowing that South Africa has a history of violence and traumatization that's not only connected to the apartheid era, but also connected to the early days of colonialism, the 1600s. So there's a history of it, and there's still present day issues and difficulties that we have with the levels of violence and traumatization that does occur. Research that has been done also gave guidance in terms of what are the levels of exposure to trauma in South African society. If we think about the landmark SASH study, in terms of the prevalence of exposure, the lifetime prevalence of PTSD within the South African setting, and that also smaller scale type of studies found that beyond the general population, or I should rather say within low resource communities, that the exposure rates and the prevalence rates of post-traumatic stress disorder is a lot higher than what we would think. And I would dare to say that generally the statistics that we have, or the data that we have, I'm sure that that it's a lot worse, if I can put it like that. Thinking about the mental health care system and the provision of mental health services within a South African context, the South African Human Rights Commission report uh, really provides a crucial and so much the needed reminder of where we are in terms of access to mental health care, specifically at a primary care level. And the WHO guidelines on the management of trauma and stressor-related disorders highlighted one specific and very crucial thing for me was, and it was that the treatment of PTSD within a setting of ongoing adversity becomes a very complicated process. So again, this context speaks to not only an intervention or reducing or ameliorating symptoms of PTSD, but essentially also starting to consider, but how do we do this, and how do these particular interventions, such as prolonged exposure, how will it perform, how will it work whilst also managing the social context that's filled with poverty, with ongoing and high levels of trauma exposure and limited resources, where most of these clients would essentially come from. So what is prolonged exposure therapy? It is a trauma therapy that has a very well-established evidence base. Several randomized control trials have been conducted over the last 3 decades. I think the very first one was in 1991, where Edna Foer and a colleague started to explore the efficacy and effectiveness of PE for the treatment of PTSD amongst rape survivors in the early 1990s, and how that has developed to working with military veterans and working in different settings, and essentially growing the evidence base for PE as a treatment for post-traumatic stress disorder. And that led to its national dissemination and implementation in the USA in the military or within the veteran affairs facilities across the USA, which in my opinion was a good example of how research had taken a psychological intervention to a particular level where it had sufficient evidence to be disseminated at that particular level. And it's also endorsed by the APA and the International Society of Traumatic Stress Studies as a first-line treatment for PTSD. But with all of this development and research taking place, and my reading of the literature, that led me to the, I want to say, obvious question. So with all of these things happening within developed countries and in industrialized societies, where are we in terms of this type of research happening within the global south, within countries like South Africa that has long-standing histories of violence and traumatization? Are we not only using these particular treatments, but are we testing them to see if they work and how they work within a country like South Africa and similar countries. And what I can say is that the very first RCT looking at the effectiveness of PE amongst adolescents was only recently completed by Yaku Rousseau a few years ago. And that was the, dare I say, the very first large-scale RCT that was conducted within a South African setting. So to some degree, that gave me the impression that a lot has been done in terms of PTSD research, especially in the field of psychological treatments for PTSD. But we, clinicians and researchers within a South African space, still had to almost had to catch up in terms of how these specific interventions perform within our context. And that essentially led to coming up with three broad aims for this particular study. And if you remember what I said in the beginning, that it was not only looking at an intervention and to see how this trauma therapy can improve symptoms of PTSD primarily, and also depression and anxiety as comorbid conditions, but it was also about the context. So aim one looked at how trauma counselors experienced working as trauma counselors. Essentially, that is what I wanted to know. What's it like providing trauma care or trauma-focused services within low-resource settings within South Africa? And what did they think about? What were their thoughts and knowledge and attitudes about empirically supported treatments or manualized trauma therapies such as PE, and whether these treatments, based on their experiences, would be something worthwhile, if it would be something to actually try and to see whether it's feasible. The second aim was essentially to see on a preliminary level whether a brief PE model would be able to reduce symptoms of PTSD amongst a small sample of participants, to essentially just to scratch the surface and to see, is there any positive outcomes? And then thirdly was to hear from the participants what the experience was like to actually go through this process. So now you can already see that the three aims that we had in this particular project touched on effectiveness, feasibility to some extent, and also starting to think about acceptability based on what clients or the participants actually reported on their experience about going through this process. And the mixed method design that we used, we had three different phases. And this also developed as I went through this particular process. In phase one was a qualitative phase, and that focused on the individual interviews with the counselors across several organizations within the Eastern Cape and the Western Cape to essentially get that understanding what was life like for them, providing care, trauma-focused services at that particular level, at a primary care level, if I might put it like that. Phase two was the PE intervention, which started in Cape Town, and then that moved to the Eastern Cape. And then lastly, we looked at the experiences of the trauma survivors and interviews with them. This is just quickly the research sites: the Rape Crisis Center in PE, the Rape Crisis Center and Observatory Cape Town, the RCC in Athlone, the Trauma Center for Survivors of Violence and Torture in Woodstock, Cape Town, the City Counseling Center in Makanda, Grahamstown. So phase one, as I said, you will also realize that we've been fortunate enough to have had a few publications from this project. And phase one looked at the trauma counselors. We interviewed 18 counselors across the Western Cape and the Eastern Cape, and conducted individual interviews. And what we found was two two major themes or two superordinate themes around the adjustment to trauma-focused work, and the second theme was trauma in the social context. To some extent, the adjustment to trauma-focused work and the sub-themes, the encountering trauma narratives, support, resilience, and going the extra mile. One can say that some of the results, or to a certain extent, these results were in line with what has already been found and written about in trauma literature, especially around the aspects of secondary traumatic stress, vicarious traumatization. But what was interesting about this phase and engaging with the trauma counselors was, in addition to the experiences of working as trauma counselors on an individual level, group level, and within the various communities and the community engagement type of work that they had done, was how the social context at various levels of their work, individually and beyond that space, started to have an effect on the experiences of working as trauma counselors. For example, them talking about providing trauma counseling work with their clients, but literally knowing that their clients would have to go back to a community or to a home or remains within a relationship that essentially is perpetuating the experiences of traumatic stress, and how living within a context of limited resources to some degree perpetuates their clients' experiences of traumatic stress, and generally how these participants felt that working within low resource communities added to some degree, it was a double burden to the nature of their work, that it was not only providing trauma-focused care and services to the individuals or the groups or the couples, but they also had to manage and navigate experiences of helplessness and navigate and think about the social factors of working within settings or communities that have limited resources. In phase two, the brief PE intervention, and just to quickly mention that standard prolonged exposure therapy is about 18 to 15 sessions of 90 minutes. And my thinking was, given what the literature says in terms of dropout rates and how one can implement certain treatments, or the difficulty of implementing certain treatments within certain settings that have contextual issues or contextual difficulties, it was necessary to think about and to see whether a shorter, brief PE intervention might be even more feasible to implement, and if it would also be effective to do that. So the intervention was essentially 6 sessions of about 60 minutes, but still consisted of the important components of standard prolonged exposure therapy, which was imaginal exposure, in vivo exposure, breathing training, emotional processing after exposure was done in the different sessions, and essentially using emotional processing theory as our theoretical framework for phase two. And this is somewhat very detailed, and it might not be very clear, but this was the procedure for phase two, where we obtained referrals from the trauma center in Woodstock, Cape Town. And as I said earlier, the intervention moved to the Eastern Cape, where I obtained referrals from the Rhodes Psychology Clinic and the Rhodes Counseling Center. And then during the baseline phase of the intervention, all eligible participants completed the post-traumatic stress symptom scale interview for DSM-5, the Beck Anxiety Inventory, and the Beck Depression Inventory. During the 6-session intervention process, all of the participants also completed the PCL-5, or the PTSD checklist for DSM-5, to monitor essentially the levels of post-traumatic stress. And the same measures used during the baseline was also used in the post-intervention assessment, and then we met with participants again 3 months later to see how they were doing. Just briefly, also the index traumas that we identified in the phase 2 sample. Most of the participants, their index trauma was that they were raped at some stage of their lives. And then we can see that in addition to that, there were also reports of witnessing injury, death, or just being witness to traumatic experiences, physical assault, sexual assault, and physical abuse as children. For the primary outcome of PTSD, we can see from baseline to post-intervention to 3-month follow-up, just in terms of the trends that we documented or that we observed, was that there was a general downward trend from baseline to post-intervention or 6 sessions later. And that at 3-month follow-up, the majority of the participants maintained their treatment gains, but also some of the participants did report an increase in some of their PTSD symptoms. And the benefit of a small-scale intervention study was that one could look from an idiographic perspective why some of the participants, had an increase in their symptoms either at post-intervention or at 3-month follow-up. The two at 3-month follow-up, here you can see that for the pseudonyms used here for Olivia and I think that is Tamara. Both of them were students at the time, and at the time of their 3-month follow-up, they reported that within the context that they found themselves, was that there were an increase reports of sexual assault on the campus where they lived, and just hearing about similar traumas that they had gone through elevated their levels of distress. So that also gave us an opportunity to somehow make sense of their distress at a 3-month follow-up. Here you can see outcomes for depression across baseline to post-intervention. And again, at 3-month follow-up, and to some degree for the most participants, there was a general reduction across most of the participants, even though 1 or 2 participants at post and at 3-month follow-up remained to have moderate to severe symptoms of depression. And for anxiety, a bit more varied, not as clear as depression and PTSD symptoms. In terms of a trend, there's really not a clear trend compared to the 2 previous outcomes. But still, some of the participants had reduced and improved symptoms across the anxiety outcome. In addition to the outcome data and the clinical measures and the scores that we used, there was also an opportunity to actually think about the treatment process, and a lot more is written about this in the actual dissertation. But what I experienced was, as the treating therapist, that, and I want to say obviously, the participants as individuals engaged differently with such a structured and manualized and to some degree somehow overwhelming therapeutic process. But what I found quite interesting was that the participants who reported or who had a more complex childhood related traumas found the structure of the therapy at times frustrating, and I'll talk a bit more about that in phase 2. And because of their long lived experiences of trauma and how trauma has to some degree infiltrated certain aspects of their lives in terms of relationships and general difficulty, there was a reoccurring need to engage in other aspects of their lives, which both them the client or the participant forced us to think about how to realign and how to refocus the process of treatment. But that really stood out. And for some participants who over-engaged, and over-engagement essentially means participants who became too distressed during the exposure experiences or the exposure sessions, required also me to think about how to remain faithful to the model, but also apply levels of flexibility. So for some participants, or the one participant specifically, asked if she could write down her trauma narrative and read out loud the trauma narrative in sessions, and not necessarily recount the trauma experience as it is within the actual manual. And observing the different levels of avoidance, from the very obvious and very gross forms of avoidance that one can engage in, as avoidance keeps PTSD alive, to the very subtle form of avoidance that I had to come to observe and try to catch in the moment, to see how somebody might recount the trauma experience in a way that's devoid of any affect, and to stop and think about how an individual might still be avoidant, even though they are engaging in that particular process. And again, I think for me afterwards, thinking about it, was the entire process, that clinical experience, that having basic counseling knowledge and experience, and general clinical experience as a psychologist and as a psychotherapist as well, proved to be quite valuable especially when I encountered some of the obstacles of frustration during those sessions, to know, understand, and to trust the treatment model, or the specific treatment that you are implementing. I think that made a huge difference for me. Having read up and having attended training in prolonged exposure therapy presented by Dr. Foa, that gave me the confidence to really believe in to understand what the model is about theoretically, and to go forward with confidence, and to share that confidence also with the clients and the participants. I think that also helped a great deal, and essentially to be flexible within the model, and to not think that, okay, this is a manualized treatment and one should do everything by the book as it's supposed to happen, but to think creatively and to work creatively, but at the same time to be creative within the framework of that particular model. I hope that makes sense. And then lastly, phase 3, we felt it was quite important to also get an understanding, to start a conversation with the actual clients about what was it like, how was this process for you, how did you experience the actual therapist? Were there certain things about the treatment process that you found useful, that you didn't like? Were there any things that you felt, just to get insight into the experiences of this particular model? And what we found to some degree is reflective of some of the very few qualitative studies that's been done on client experiences of prolonged exposure therapy. Was exposure, initially engaging with exposure, was found to be distressing, and that's also theoretically expected. But habituation then occurred over certain sessions, and clients or participants could tolerate the distress, and the tolerance and being able to be able to do it. As some of the participants said, that they had thoughts about dropping out. They had thought about, sending me an email to cancel a session, to just not come back. But at some point, they also realized that, but I'm actually talking about it, something that I haven't done in years. So I'm actually engaging in it, not always fully understanding or how to make sense of it, but something's working. And that kept them going. As I said earlier, some of the obstacles with, or that some of the participants experienced, was related to wanting to focus on other aspects of their lives and not necessarily understanding why do we have to go and focus on this particular trauma experience. And that made me also just reflect about my own level of experience, my own level of knowledge in terms of this particular therapy, and also the fit between the actual participant and the intervention as well. A very interesting finding was around gender, and I think I might not have mentioned this, but the entire sample they were all women. They were, yeah, they were all women, and what was interesting when it came to questions about how you experienced the therapist was for some. They felt that it was quite odd to talk to a man about rape, about how they've about their experiences of rape, and as some of them said, no, I didn't know how much detail to go into. For other participants, they didn't really have a strong view or any significant opinion about whether it was male or female. But what also came to the fore from the data was that moving from those initial perceptions, and what made a difference for them was the space that they found themselves in, and the type of engagement, of support, of being non-judgmental, of empathy, that somehow took the ideas of gender and talking to such somebody of the opposite sex, that essentially moved to the background. And what was at the fore was the quality of the therapeutic process and that therapeutic alliance that made a difference for those participants. Okay, so that was phase 3 of the project, and essentially going through those 3 phases and ending up almost at the beginning again to think about effectiveness, feasibility, and acceptability. Phase 2 of this study, the intervention, is or provided preliminary indication that even a brief model of PE can produce a positive outcomes, even though it was a small intervention, it was a small sample, and there are many limitations to it. But it was a start to actually think more about, okay, how can we move forward in terms of further establishing and growing the evidence base for prolonged exposure therapy as an effective therapy within a South African context. The feasibility of disseminating PE within our context, the findings of phase 1, the social context that the trauma counselors spoke about, the limited resources, limited infrastructure, who can provide trauma-focused work and who cannot provide or psychological services within our context, and thinking about all the regulatory barriers that one also have to navigate. So giving me food for thought in terms of the feasibility of dissemination and acceptability to build upon the data or the initial data that I got from phase 3, to think beyond and to think more about the social contextual factors such linked to acceptability in terms of language, in terms of culture, to explore all those particular elements as I move forward. So essentially, still trying to juggle these three factors or crucial components on this process of implementation of PE in South Africa. And where are we now? Where am I now in terms of current projects? closer to the tail end of my PhD, I made contact with Dr. Sheila Rauch at Emory University. She's one of the co-authors of the second edition of prolonged exposure therapy. And she's, over the last 10 years, she's worked on prolonged exposure for primary care, where she's been training mental health providers in implementing PE at a primary care level. That's a 4 to 8 session model, and we are trying to see how we can collaborate and to see if we can also implement that particular model within South Africa. Still working with the trauma center in Woodstock with those counselors there, and planning to do some training and development with them. Simply put, teaching prolonged exposure on the MA clinical program here at Rhodes University, and postgraduate research projects. There are 2 projects currently ongoing now, and the one is looking at online PE for PTSD among university students, and the treatment of or using PE for the treatment of PTSD and suicidal behavior as well. Thank you. If I can stop sharing.
Okay, thank you, Dr. Booysen. That was really interesting, considering our high rates of PTSD. It's really nice to see all these different tools that are available and the possible contribution that PET may have within this context. If anyone has any questions, put your hands up and you can ask Dr. Booysen yourself, or you can write it in the comments if you're too shy and we'll read it out to him. Ashraf, I see your hand up. I'm going to give you a chance now. But before I do, Dr. Booysen, can you, so a lot of students, psychology students, their dream is to develop some sort of intervention, right? Tell us a bit more about some of the challenges that you had in doing this study.
Oh, yeah. So I'm not even too sure where to start. I think logistics. I think the nature of implementation research and intervention research requires one to think of so many elements in terms of getting research sites and the process of doing, if I can call it, experimental type of research. That entire procedure required a lot of effort and thinking and learning. So I think the biggest challenge for me was essentially learning as I was going along in terms of this type of project. But what really helped me was seeing the value of the research, and to see that that there is a gap, there is a need to actually think about these questions. And as I said in the beginning, not just necessarily about, let me just do an intervention study, but let me do an intervention study that speaks to feasibility and acceptability, so that I can almost preempt some of the, dare I say, critique that such a study might get. That, some of those critiques might be, but it's just another import, from the north, into the south. So Rizwana, that was, just learning as I continued, and juggling many things at the same time. Yeah, but also, I had the necessary funding that made everything possible. Yeah, I have to say.
Okay, thank you. Ashraf, you had your hand up. Do you have a question?
I just posted it in the chat.
Okay.
Ask it. Oh, here we go. Ashraf wants to know if you should scale up this intervention. How can we do this?
I would say absolutely yes. In terms of upscaling it and continue going forward. I think the next step for me in terms of scaling this up and moving forward is to actually now work with mental health care providers or counselors or social workers or persons within organizations that one can start to train and to use implementation science methodologies to look at how do we work on the no-do gap, as implementation science calls it. And obviously this is nothing new, but for this research, for me, the big next important step is training and development, to train persons within organizations, and not just a organization, but to see how the training process goes, how the implementation process goes, whether it's feasible and acceptable. But there are also obviously many barriers when it comes to that line of work. And the one particular barrier that I'm thinking about and that I'm working on now is that there isn't enough psychologists, there isn't enough registered counselors, social workers at primary care level. So the question for me is, who do I work with and who do I train? And what are some of the regulatory limitations and barriers I need to keep in mind and actually, dare I say, also push through to actually get this type of research to the next level? Because if that's not going to happen, then the sad part is that this type of research won't be able to go forward. So that's the next thing to think about. I hope that answers your question, Ashraf.
Okay. Thank you, Ashraf says. Thanks. Dr. Kutsia also has a question for you. She says, there's clearly a strong evidence base for PET, but how does this approach compare to other approaches, and what is the main critique against PET?
Okay. How does it compare to other approaches, such as, I'm assuming, maybe other trauma-focused treatments, which would be cognitive processing therapy, narrative exposure therapy, CBT for PTSD? Okay, Brian said yes. So if one looks at the treatment guidelines that was published last year, in 2019, by the International Society of Traumatic Stress Studies, PE is a first-line treatment among other treatments. So I'd say that we're quite fortunate to have options when it comes to when we think about psychological treatments for post-traumatic stress disorder. In comparison, in terms of research that's been done, I think, or let me rather say, I know that that PE has probably the most RCTs that's been conducted. Some of the critique when it does come to prolonged exposure therapy, and I think a long-standing critique, and I'm not even sure if it is a critique, if it is a critique, but more so a misconception, is clinicians' resistance to or apprehension when it comes to using exposure therapy. So that is still a barrier when you know that you would have to ask somebody to talk about the experiences of rape or hijacking or mugging or whatever it is. And what I've experienced and learned is, once you actually learn the model, once you understand the theory of it, and the model infused with your clinical experience, and when I say clinical experience or basic counseling experience, essentially is to be able to establish a therapeutic alliance, to be supportive, to have empathy for the person you're working with, to create that relationship that would enable an individual to actually take that risk, to take that leap of faith. That goldfish on the start of my PowerPoint slide is actually reflective of the treatment of trauma, because trauma does limit your experiences and it starts to take over your life, and you start to live a life that's not necessarily reflective of how you would want to live it. So one of the misconceptions and slash critiques of prolonged exposure therapy by some of and that you would find within the literature is that it might sometimes be too overwhelming for participants or for clients to actually engage in. And I do think it's important to stress that PE is a treatment for PTSD, for post-traumatic stress disorder. And I think in saying that, I also acknowledge that trauma and PTSD, and that there might be other nuanced presentations of traumatic stress that might not necessarily be a suitable fit. It might not be a good match for PE. Yeah.
Thank you for that response. Bronwyn also says thank you. Dr. Booysen, I want to thank you for your presentation today. I found it was really informative and I very much enjoyed it. And we'll be placing this podcast on our YouTube channel. So anyone who hasn't seen it will be able to watch this podcast afterwards. So again, thank you for your time, for your presentation. I think that this work still there's so much more that can come from this. So I'm hoping that in future years you do more research and come back to the colloquium and present to us again. It's quite exciting work. And I'd like to thank everyone else for attending today and for your questions. And we'll see you for our next colloquium, which will be next month, where Mariam Saleh and Megan Snow will be presenting some of their work. Thank you, everyone. Bye-bye.
Thank you. Bye-bye.